Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to start off by thanking my colleague, the Member of Parliament for Thornhill, for a very thoughtful presentation in this House. Mr. Speaker, a debate on C-14 is an example of this House of Commons at its best. Canadians do not send us here to have unanimous agreement on issues of the day. We are here to represent our ridings, the constituents that sent us to Ottawa. We belong to political parties, we have different leaders' roles, but we're Canadians that bring an experience and a point of view to this chamber. And infrequently, we share that view in the personal story people bring to the House of Commons. So today, on the difficult subject of C-14, I got to learn my colleague's perspective and personal experience with a member of his family, his personal experience covering the Rodriguez case in the 1990s as a journalist, and how that has combined to formulate his position on assisted dying or euthanasia, Mr. Speaker. And I think members should welcome that. It's unfortunate we don't have a full House for important debates like this, Mr. Speaker. We get so busy, but it's important for us to learn the perspective that each of us bring as a member of this chamber. And we're not sent here to be surrogates for other interests or to run polls. We're sent with the judgment to try and look at legislation from the lens of our own experience, education, and background. And many members have brought that to this floor today, and I applaud you for it. I've looked at C-14, Mr. Speaker, and I've struggled with it. Certainly, this is a place where there's two sides on this issue, maybe even broken down more than that, but there's compassion at the heart of both sides. And that's what's often forgotten in this debate. And why I say this should be the House of Commons at its best, Mr. Speaker, is the Supreme Court of Canada recognized the role of Parliament to clarify the law with respect to euthanasia in a way that's thoughtful and complies with their direction. Carter. This is indeed one of the important debates that we should not fear in our House of Commons. Now, Madam Speaker, we should ensure that we take part vigorously and share the perspectives like my friend from Thornhill has. And I've looked at C-14 not just as a member of this chamber, but also as a lawyer, Mr. Speaker. So I've reviewed the case law going back on this some 20 years, Madam Speaker. I've also reviewed it as a father of two children, a husband, and I know my wife's watching today, and the son of a strong woman who died when I was 9 from cancer. And my most formative memories of my mother, Molly, are in her palliative stage of that disease. So, of course, all of these things combine, Madam Speaker, to formulate my position on C-14 and what I feel is the government's position with respect to Carter, but I'm using my speech today to talk about some of the concerns I have with it. And I will start with a Supreme Court of Canada quote, Justice Sapinka. I quote, "Regardless of one's personal views as to whether the distinctions drawn between the withdrawal of treatment and palliative care on one hand and assisted suicide on the other are practically compelling, the fact remains that these distinctions are maintained and can be persuasively defended." Within the Rodriguez decision in 1993, Madam Speaker, the Supreme Court struggled with the role of the state at end of life in euthanasia or assisted dying, and whether that role should be passive with respect to palliative care, treating and helping and comforting and limiting pain at end of life, or whether the role of the state should be active, end of life, an active role in that. And what Justice Sapinka in the majority court in 1993 said, that the bright line of the active versus passive could be persuasively defended. That was the language of the court. And that is why the most compelling case, and I know Canadians remember, as my friend from Thornhill did, the tragic circumstance of Ms. Rodriguez and her compassionate arguments with respect to that. But this law, and C-14, is about the role of the state in that. It's not suicide alone, Madam Speaker, and that's why we have to have legislation that both accepts the Carter decision but brings us to a position that Canadians can be comfortable with. The persuasively defended, Madam Speaker. So the second quote I'll use from Carter, and why the court at 117 found the position of the trial judge to be compelling. They said, I quote, "We agree that with the trial judge that the risks associated with physician-assisted death can be limited through a carefully designed and monitored system of safeguards." And at 120, they went on to say, "We should not lightly assume that the regulatory regime will function defectively." But what the Supreme Court did, Madam Speaker, was allowed this Parliament to come up with a regulatory regime to function effectively. And how that function is important, Madam Speaker, is to make sure what both courts, the court of the Sapinka decision to the unanimous court of today in Carter, said that the decisionally vulnerable should be safeguarded. And that was clearly part of the direction of both courts, Madam Speaker. And it's this key element and the aspect of what I consider to be the challenge for a ironclad regulatory regime, the slippery slope argument, where I find C-14 failing and why I'm not supportive of it, Madam Speaker. The Carter decision, the court said they're not in a straitjacket because the court rejected euthanasia in the Rodriguez decision, and they look at it in light of recent charter decisions, Madam Speaker. But they are really looking to Parliament for a system that does not allow the decisionally vulnerable, those impacted by a terrible diagnosis, those under the strain and stress of an illness, to, at a moment, want to take their life, Madam Speaker, and have the state play a role in that. Both courts recognize that those are vulnerable Canadians that need to be safeguarded. And my concern has been that this is not going to take place within this legislation presented before this chamber. And I think if you actually look at the great work the All-Party Committee did, all members, from the aspects of the All-Party Committee to what's before C-14, the bill actually reflects more of the work done by the Conservative opposition on that committee, Madam Speaker. But it certainly shows an indication of where the regulatory regime regarding assisted death will go. It will likely include, at some point in the future, mature minors. It will likely include, because this was the recommendation of the All-Party Committee, people afflicted with mental health. And as a veterans advocate, Madam Speaker, for years before I joined Parliament and had the privilege of being the Veterans Minister, I have met dozens of veterans who would have been decisionally vulnerable when suffering from their depression, their post-traumatic stress disorder, or another operational stress injury, but who are now leading productive lives as mothers and fathers. Some return to their role in the military, and many are actually advocating and helping other veterans. So I get very concerned about a regime that indicates that that's where it will go. I know C-14 does not contain those provisions, but the slippery slope element that both the Sapinka courts and the McLaughlin courts consider show that that's what we should anticipate in a few years, Madam Speaker. And with this House of Commons being well-intentioned, but with a regulatory regime unable to look at every situation, I think the persuasively defended bright line has not been accomplished in C-14. Another example I'll show, Madam Speaker, is the Carter family themselves expressed concern with C-14, but in this chamber, the Minister of Justice, in her thoughtful remarks, and I appreciated those remarks she gave, suggested both appellants would have been provided for their assisted death by C-14. Well, not according to the family. And the minister had to use language that said a condition that can become reasonably foreseeable of death. So even the distinction between the named plaintiff in this case, Madam Speaker, the position of their family and the people that advocated with them is at odds with C-14 and the position of the Justice Minister. So if anything shows the fact that there is already a slippery slope and a very difficult framework to set. I'm concerned that this has been rushed, Madam Speaker, and it will not defend and safeguard against the decisionally vulnerable. Can C-14 be improved? Or if Parliament can take more time, can it address this issue that confronts this place with Carter? In my weighing of all of the issues, Madam Speaker, as I said, as a parliamentarian that tries to draw upon my own experiences, as everyone does in this place, I do not think C-14 can do that. I still feel that the persuasively defended bright line accomplished in the Sapinka decision has not been met here by C-14, and many of the concerns providing the slippery slope that the Supreme Court in Carter raised have not been addressed by C-14 either, Madam Speaker. But I would like to say that I have appreciated people sharing their point of view on this important issue. Parliament should not fear important debates. We should come here in a respectful and thoughtful tone. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Spadina-Fort York.
Putting aside the fact we're under a deadline because of inaction in the previous Parliament and that an extension has already been sought at the Supreme Court, putting the timetable issues aside, the issue that was raised that I think concerns me is this notion that somebody with a psychiatric condition, post-traumatic stress disorder, I think was the issue that was raised, would be able to avail themselves far too easily of the physician-assisted dying. Does the member not reflect upon the provisions around requiring attending doctors or medical personnel to assess the psychiatric condition of the individual seeking this? Are those not the safeguards that would prevent an unfortunate circumstance from being pursued based on psychiatric conditions which were present when the request was made? Are those safeguards not significant enough to prevent a mistake from being made? And could they not be strengthened with further conversation in committee?
Honourable member for Durham.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my friend for the question. You know, even his framing of this, mistakes can be made, sort of shows that it is very difficult for Parliament or for any sort of regulatory regime or the professions themselves to set certainty here. In fact, C-14, one of my main concerns with it is it essentially kicks the issue back to the courts by using a reasonably foreseeable standard, which is kind of the linchpin of our common law, Madam Speaker. But when it comes to the case he was talking about of a veteran with PTSD, there is no reasonable foreseeable end to that person's life at all, provided there's proper intervention, Madam Speaker. Now, the depths of depression, and I've talked to military members, low rank, high rank, when the black dog, as Winston Churchill described it, hits you, you do think your only option is to end your life. But I've met veterans who are now helping dozens of other veterans because they found a path to wellness through a whole variety of programs, and they made the decision to err on the side of help and not on the side of tragedy. So the very fact that the special committee put mental injuries, many of which can be treated, in the framework for euthanasia shows how difficult it will be to find the right balance.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. You know, I thank my member, the member, for his remarks, and I want to just underline, we've had some discussion here about psychological suffering. The legislation very clearly includes psychological suffering as a criteria. In Section 241(2)(2), it talks about physical or psychological suffering being a criteria. And the member, I think, quite rightly illustrates how having these provisions could create a more permissive environment for suicide more generally. We've heard about his concerns about veterans. The member for Winnipeg Centre has spoken, I think, quite eloquently about the effect of some of this in the Aboriginal community. So I wonder if the member would agree with me that we should simply remove the reference to psychological suffering from the legislation. It would be cleaner and clearer if we were talking specifically about physical suffering, and it wouldn't create some of these problems that he and others have raised.
The honourable member for Durham.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I'd like to thank my friend and learned colleague who's been providing a lot of perspective on this issue for that question. That's one issue that I think needs to be addressed at committee or immediately with respect to C-14, because it shows that already the legislation and the framework is flawed, Madam Speaker. And going back to my earlier comments, this is a difficult circumstance where I think we're faced as parliamentarians with compassion on both sides of the issue. And provided we're able to have shared time between the member from Thornhill and myself, who may disagree on the final elements of what we see missing in C-14, it shows the gravity of this decision and why we should have this debate, why more members should be here to share their personal views with respect to concerns on either side. Thank you, Madam Speaker.